Okay, welcome everyone. I'm here with Dr. Nando Lewis. He is a project officer with the global support team with DTM of the International Organization for Migration, currently based in Berlin. Thanks for being with us, Nando.
And thanks for having me. It's very
Yeah,
interesting to be here.
great. So maybe you could just start off telling me a little bit about who you are, your background, and the things you've done with DTM.
Yeah, so I have taken a bit of a roundabout route in my studies, maybe similar to many of you students as well. I went from an undergraduate in psychology and primate behavior through to a master's in security studies and then a PhD in geography. And ended up broadly looking at refugee displacement decisions related to conflict and climate factors and South Sudanese refugees going to Uganda and Kenya. And since then, I've been with IOM for 5 years and working initially on citizen-driven assistance, which is how people help each other in displacement contexts, because a huge amount of assistance comes from your neighbors, your communities, neighboring communities, and to better understand how that works. And now working a lot on climate related topics, our data collection related to climate change, our data analysis related to climate change, and then surge support to different country offices when needed.
Awesome. So super interesting. So could you talk me through just a few of the bit more detail, some of the projects you've looked at, and perhaps some of the challenges of working in those contexts, in particular with, data and classification models, hidden populations, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll talk about more is maybe starting up an operation, which essentially you need information fast. And to do that, you need a host of things in place. You need people to collect the information, to work out what's needed, to develop a questionnaire. You need questions. You need to know what information would be useful to share with government, to share with other humanitarian partners. You need to develop a methodology, and then you need agreements, because you can't just go into an area and do things without talking to the people who manage that area, to the local people, to make sure that anything you're doing is essentially benefiting people, but you're not stepping on toes, you're not getting into problems in terms of, especially around data. People become very sensitive, and understandably. So at the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2022, I went to Romania to help set up our data collection operations there, where we hadn't had a presence before. And essentially, you need to work out where are you going to collect data. So I'll just share my screen so you can visualize the map as well. But Romania has a lot of border with Ukraine. Hopefully you can see it. And here we can see Ukraine in the top right. And Romania has a long stretch of border here in the north, and then a shorter stretch of border here in the east. And so these immediately would be the locations you think, okay, where are people crossing and where can we speak to them and interview them, collect information about what their needs are. And of course, there are sensitivities around interviewing people directly at the border, because they'll have just finished what could have been a very long journey. You need to be conscious of those problems. Here was probably the main point of arrival of Ukrainians into Romania. And as you can see, it's a fairly major road, which means lots of cars coming through, which means not much time to speak to anyone, because they'll cross the border and then they'll drive straight out. Whereas down in the east, you've got the barrier of the Danube between Ukraine and Romania, which means you've got a ferry crossing here in Isaccea. And because it's a ferry crossing, there are larger numbers of people who then wait on the other side in Isaccea in Romania, and you have a greater opportunity to speak to them. So it's about identifying where will you be able to talk to people most, and then where will you miss people. And if you miss them at the border, where are you most likely to then be able to speak to them? The capital city, Bucharest, is a likely location, and other major cities like Cluj, Brasov, and major transit points, for example, Iași, where are many people coming through Moldova, and then train stations and bus stations in Iași where they would continue their onward travel. And so a lot of this initial phase is spent trying to figure out, where do we target? How can we target as widely as possible to make sure that we get as representative as possible a sample? Of course, there'll always be missing populations. And so you'll, like I mentioned, have people arriving by car and you won't be able to talk to them at the borders. You'll possibly be able to talk to them at the immigration center in Bucharest, in the capital. But that's potentially a huge portion of the population that you have no contact with. Another example of, I'd say a good example of missing populations, where you have entirely missing populations rather than hidden populations. So a missing population would be you miss everyone, regardless of their specific demographic or intersectional status, whereas hidden populations would be, for example, women of a certain ethnic minority would be a hidden population who may not be included. So in Palu, in central Sulawesi, just to orient you, there was a tsunami or an earthquake followed by a tsunami followed by liquefaction, where lots of the city just, or not lots, but parts of the city just disappeared under essentially mud. And you had a city of maybe official estimates around 450,000 people, some unofficial estimates as high as 600,000 people, as is the case with almost every city worldwide. And the first set of populations that you might miss in a city are smaller groups. So because of the way a humanitarian response is designed, if it's a group, I think the threshold in Indonesia at the time was, if it's fewer than 8 people, we don't collect data on them, because there's just not the capacity to respond to everyone, to deliver assistance to everyone. And so, especially in urban areas, there are fewer locations where you can have large groups of people. So if we look here, you can already identify, okay, here we've got a large mosque with a large open area, and you would expect that there could be a large group of people staying here. But nearby, you might have a small garden behind a few houses where some people will allow people whose houses have been destroyed to set up some tents, for example. And that data might not be collected. And if you multiply that across a city, that becomes quite a substantial amount of people, because there are limited large open spaces, lots of smaller open spaces. And so you could have entirely hidden populations in that sense. But then also, one of the issues specific to this context was that DTM data collection counted around 200,000 people in displacement contexts. We've got an official estimate of around 450,000 people, unofficial estimates of around 600,000 people, and sort of evidence on the ground suggested that the city was largely empty initially. So that means even if the methodology is completely bad with this focus on slightly large groups, and we double it to 400,000 of being the actual number, that still means quite, potentially up to 200,000 people are somewhere. And the idea was that, well, they're not in Palu anymore or in the surrounding areas, but they've potentially traveled to Balikpapan or south to other cities, Makassar, or perhaps to rural areas where they had lived. And it becomes very difficult to try and identify where they've moved, because there are so many potential areas, and that's a completely missing population.
Super interesting. So, I mean, what kind of strategies do you employ to deal with these challenges? So there seem to be two kinds of things that cropped up there. So one was the data that you can collect can be difficult dependent upon the nature of the area. So, for instance, when you were talking about the borders, right? Were you looking at different kinds of proxy measures or proxy indicators there or anything? How did the data collection exercise differ? And I guess the second question is, when you do have these like really hidden populations, how do you approach still trying to look at a data-driven approach when there are all these hidden populations?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing specific to a humanitarian response is that you eventually need to understand that quick and good enough is better than close to perfect and slow. You need the information today, ideally, if not tomorrow. And so you just work around the knowledge that there will be problems and there will be imperfections in what you're doing. But you just try and limit the impact of that as far as possible through making sure you have sound methodologies, through the data collection, trying to make sure which population groups might you miss, and if you miss them, what would be your strategy for trying to get them. So an example, maybe separate from this, but for people moving to climate factors, they will often say, well, actually, I'm moving because of economic reasons, because the drought has impacted their livelihood. They don't have enough produce to feed themselves and their family, let alone sell at market to engage in trade. So for them, it's their financial well-being, but the crux of it is a long-term drought that has impacted that. And so if we're interested in that specific profile of person, what questions do we need to add in? So of course, people always say, this is my reason for doing it, but then can you add in a question that targets specifically what their issue was? So is there any, were you impacted by drought in the last 5 years? Is a very simple way of doing that, but you can get more and more sophisticated for different sections of the population. A lot of it then will also happen on the data analysis side. And firstly is just, what is the internal consistency of the data? If I start taking small portions of it out, do I still get the same results? Is a very simple way to check, are there just certain results that are biasing everything? But then really to think about what are the real world things that would impact the reliability and validity of the data. So sort of easy starting point is people, geography, and time. At what points were people involved in answering the questions? Do different groups of people respond differently? Have we asked all the different groups of people we need to ask? And then what is that person telling us about? Are they telling us about themselves, about their family, about their community? And how does that then impact how we interpret the data? Then in the actual asking of the questions, you have people involved in the asking. Is there something about a certain enumerator that makes a difference? If you've got a male enumerator interviewing a female, depending on certain cultural contexts, that could change quite drastically the way the respondent, the woman, answers the questions. And an example we had from Romania, where we checked very carefully with the enumerators, so the data collectors, was just, are they doing their job? And one way to check that is you look at the average time taken for the interview to assess, you know, how much detail are they going into. And we had one enumerator who actually averaged, I think, for 80% of his interviews, under 3 minutes. And this is a questionnaire of probably 30 questions. Just reading all that, I tried it, I went through just tapping all the answers yourself takes 3 minutes. So you can immediately infer what the problem there was, that he was just making up data. And so it's having these closer checks to understand that people are people, and these sorts of things will always happen. Can we identify them? Then you've sort of got the geography, where were the questions being asked? So like you mentioned, you've got the northern border, you've got eastern borders, so that those physical locations, are there differences? If there are they differences that we would expect? because there will always be, or there will be qualitative reasons for it. And as long as it's related to the people moving, for example, if you've got different population types coming through the northern border versus the eastern border because they're coming from different areas of Ukraine, then great, we can expect that. It's as long as it's not related to the inherent quality of your own data collection. And then the type of location also matters, whether it's a train station, a border crossing point, a park, an immigration center. You'll have naturally different types of people will be more likely to be found at different types of locations. So have you got a fair spread? Do you have completely different results from your data collected in train stations compared to the immigration center? If you do, what does that mean? And so really just trying to go into the nitty-gritty of the data to understand, what the problems are. Essentially, you're just constantly thinking, what factors might have biased this data, and how can I make sure it doesn't impact the analysis? And this is true for all data collection, but probably most true for data collected by humans, but say even remote sensing and satellite imagery can be impacted by cloud cover. The big drought and sort of related data sets will often issue corrections when they realize they hadn't calibrated their models properly. And so you'll see 6 months down the line, actually, you need to rerun all your analyses because this data was slightly wrong. And there's always going to be error. You just have to be aware of it as a possibility.
So, are there examples that use ideas from big data in addressing these problems with hard to find populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that even if you go back to 2011 with the Haiti earthquake response, there was a lot of good research done using call detail records. So where people made phone calls or sent text messages from, and they found that if you looked at the last major holiday before the earthquake hit, that correlated very closely with where people then moved to after the earthquake for, or essentially were displaced to. So often back to family, back to home areas. And so that proved to be a very effective way, even though it took quite some time after the earthquake hit to actually do, but an effective way to identify where people had gone. And we tried to do something similar in Indonesia with the Pasigala response, because of this potentially up to 20,000 to 200,000 people who had seemingly gone somewhere else, to look at Facebook login data. And there were some suggestions that people were logging in more from Makassar than they had been in Pasigala, for example. And then also call detail records to try and identify where are people making their phone calls from now. And this is something that in the future, as long as the data privacy problems and issues can be fully addressed, could become a very efficient and useful way of identifying these problems. You can see at Facebook do a lot of this work now with their data for Meta for Good, I think. And so with the Turkey earthquake, there was also a lot of work done by Meta to publish data on whether businesses were still active, where people were logging in from to try and get indications of what the level of recovery is, as well as the levels of displacement and mobility, and try your best to work with it.
Super interesting. So just before we wrap up, maybe you could say a little bit about what you'd like to see in your field in the future. Are there things you'd like to see developed?
I mean, maybe I'm slightly biased because I also try and work with the data after it's been collected, but it would be great to see in the field as a whole more standardization, because that makes analysis more straightforward. Absolutely continuing to first and foremost focus on that humanitarian response and questions that are relevant to the specific context, but then also making sure we think about if we added just one or two questions that could make the difference for this being useful for a future analysis or not, that would be fantastic. It does require a huge amount of effort. It requires someone to figure out what those questions are and communicate them effectively. So it's much easier to say than it is to actually do in practice. And then I think it would be useful to have more openness about how data is collected. So as I was speaking above about the different problems that do impact the quality of data collection, and often you'll sit in a country level meeting with other humanitarian and government partners, and someone will talk about the data they've collected and not talk at all about the methodology. And as soon as you start asking questions about it, you realize there are a huge number of problems. And of course, there's that balance of quick and good enough versus high quality but slow. But sometimes it does go too far over to quick.
Super interesting, Nando. Thanks very much for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.